do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome back to my channel and to the new Eon Agora series. My name is Marco Visconti, and here we talk about Thelema, magic, mysticism, and the Western esoteric tradition as a whole. Before we start, I would like to thank all my students, supporters, patrons, channel members, all of you who continue to support my work. You too can do it in many different ways, and you will find all the relevant links in the description of the video and in the comments below. Let's get started now with today's topic. There is a particular kind of occult discourse that I have grown deeply tired of. Not because it is passionate or heretical, kind of like those things, and not because it makes difficult claims. Occultism has always drawn people who speak in symbols bigger than themselves, and sometimes that is part of its power. But the problem begins elsewhere. It begins when someone wants the prestige of scholarship, the aura of revelation, and also the immunity of prophecy all at once. Because, once you start fusing those three things together, then the argument, in my opinion, decays into pure performance. And once that happens, it becomes very difficult to tell whether one is being asked to think or simply to submit. And so that is what I want to talk about today. And, before the vultures starts to gather in the comment section below, let it be clear that this is not a feud. This is not gossip, because thankfully that died with the last dregs of occult Twitter a few years ago, for those of you who remember. And really thanks all the gods for that. This isn't one more occult personality drama for people who spend too much time online circling the same names. What interests me is rather a pattern, a method, if we're being generous, a way of claiming authority while reading text, and managing doubt that can look serious from a distance, but then becomes much less impressive the closer you get. Once you notice this pattern, then you start seeing it everywhere. For instance, you see it in the way Lineage is claimed. You see it in the way the texts are made to say more than they actually can bear. You see it in the way critics are dismissed. And most of all, you see it in the way weak evidence is not treated as a problem, then somehow it becomes transformed into part of the proof itself. And that is the point where I lose my patience. Because when bad evidence supports the claim, and then missing evidence supports the claim, and then criticism itself supports the claim, then one is no longer dealing with interpretation in any serious sense. One is dealing with a closed system and a self-protecting mythology of authority. Let me start with Lineage, because this is where the mechanism is often the easiest to see. One of the oldest habits in modern esotericism is the claim that the real tradition is hidden, displays, or withdrawn from the public eye, that the outer institution has decayed, that the visible order is a shell, whereby the true current has gone underground and survives only in some finer, purer, secret continuity. As a myth, this is familiar enough, right? Occultism thrives on myths of concealment, of exile, and then return maybe, rediscovery. I have no issue with that on a symbolic level, and I have written at length about the concept of mythopoiesis in my books and in my teachings. Now, the trouble begins when myth is presented as pure history, especially when the historical chain becomes weakest at the exact point where the claim most depends on it. The structure is always the same, but here I will discuss my own tradition, Thelema. So you have Crowley placed on one end, and then a later figure is inserted into the line as a recipient, inheritor, or even transmitter. And then a contemporary claimant appears as the latest flowering of the hidden continuity. It sounds impressive. It sounds almost inevitable. But when you reach the actual hinge, the point where the transmission is supposed to have happened, the ground suddenly becomes very shaky. The documentation becomes unclear. The facts are disputed. The meetings may have happened or may have not. The details are vague, and some people then start to doubt the story altogether. Now, in any honest intellectual setting, that would be the moment where the tone changes. Claims becomes narrow, certainty kind of recedes, and one says very simply that the evidence does not allow us to go any further than this. But that's not what happens. Instead, that uncertainty is then absorbed into the story. That gap becomes increasingly meaningful. The lack of proof almost becomes part of the hidden logic of this game. So the Lineage's compromised state becomes a sign of its esoteric depth. The break itself becomes a mystery to be revered. And this is nothing else but pure devotion disguised and sold as the reconstitution of something purer, truer, older. The inflation becomes harder to defend when you compare it with the much more modest accounts offered by the tradition that is supposedly involved in. There, one often finds something far less dramatic. A meeting, perhaps, an exchange of ideas in Trafalgar Square here in London. An encouragement, possibly, towards meditation or Eastern studies or whatever. Maybe some later initiation received elsewhere. All of this may be interesting. It may even end up becoming biographically relevant, maybe down the line, some centuries down the line. But this is not the same thing as a demonstrable initiatory chain carrying an occult order forward in time. And the real problem here is that when someone knows that the evidence is thin and yet continues to speak in a register of restored authority, what is being performed, because performance it is not some sort of continuity of a hidden tradition, but in my opinion is just entitlement. That would be already enough to make one cautious. But then there's a second move that is in some ways even more revealing, because it shows how authority is protected even when its foundations are fragile. One might imagine that the larger the claim, the greater the burden of proof, right? In sane discourse, that is how things work. Here, the reverse happens. External verification becomes less important, precisely when it becomes more inconvenient. Any sort of public evidence is pushed aside. Any sort of actual documentation is then treated as secondary. Any sort of recognition from serious sources is then waved away. Instead, we are told that the real criterion is some sort of inward resonance, the mark of prophecy itself. Something like, those who are meant to understand will understand. Those who need to hear the call will hear it. Those who are not persuaded are not the unconvinced because the case is weak, but because they lack the ear or the affinity or any sort of spiritual organ required to recognize what is plain there for the elect. And this is a very old trick. It's charismatic logic in one of its purest forms. When verification is moved inward at the exact moment, outward verification becomes kind of awkward. The believer becomes the evidence. The skeptic becomes something defective. And there you go. The circle is closed. And once that circle is in place, criticism cannot really land because it has already been reclassified in advance. It is no longer disagreement, it is blindness to the truth. And from there, the same pattern starts showing up in textual interpretation. You can see this especially clearly in certain readings of Thelema's central text and Tantra, Liber Alve Legis. Readings that confuse symbolic intensity with historical demonstration. And I mean the kind of reading that treats Crowley not primarily as the herald of a new eon revelation, but as the almost unwitting vehicle of an older Egyptian current resurfacing through him under another name. Now, I understand fully why that kind of reading attracts anyone. It has a deep atmosphere, it has weight, it bears antiquity, it has almost layers of ritual memory. Think about the dead gods, the stele, the bornless rite, the Cairo revelation, all that underworld symbolism, all of it gathered into one single dramatic moment. It feels rich, it feels secrets, it flatters the interpreter with the sense that they have uncovered something buried and profound. But a reading can feel very rich and still be intellectually weak. And had it remained openly speculative or poetic or myth-making in the proper sense, one could live with it. I could live with it, no problems. The deeper issue is that Liber Al itself resists being reduced that way, because if one takes Crowley seriously on the level of doctrine, the book is not just announcing a sort of return of the old, it's announcing an eonic break, a complete rupture in religious consciousness. The Aeon of Horus is not just the one of Osiris in different clothing. It is not ancient Egypt reassembled with a more dramatic packaging. It is presented as a new dispensation, however unstable and hybrid or difficult that revelation may be. And so when someone insists on reading it as though it were fundamentally the resurfacing of an older funerary current, even if Crowley himself played with this trope for the very same reasons contemporary self-made gurus are doing, then one begins to suspect that the text is no longer leading the reading. And once you look more closely, the fit becomes even worse. That funerary Egyptian religion is not just a convenient pile of death symbols, it has specific structures, it has specific ritual assumption, has specific theological commitments. Crowley's text, instead, gives us something rather different. It gives us ecstasy, rapture, ferocity, inversion, a sort of almost solar violence, anti-moral intensity, and none of the recognizable balance that would justify simply slotting it into a properly Egyptian underworld framework. At this point, what is offered is not a bold reading of the text, it is some sort of prior drama imposed upon it. It is a drama of hidden continuity, of specifically chosen transmission, of, again, secret inheritance that is only there to give present-day gurus some sort of legitimacy. And that, finally, is the heart of my objection. I do not object to heresy. I've been called heretical myself. Heresy is often where living thought begins. I surely do not object to symbolic daring. Without it, occultism would collapse into filing cabinets and death rhetoric, some sort of ceremonial taxidermy, which is sadly true for most traditions already. I do not even object to ambitious claims, provided the person making them accepts the burden that those claims actually create. What I object to is a style of discourse that places the person pushing it in a untouchable position. This is a style in which weak provenance becomes hidden authenticity, as we saw before, in which uncertainty becomes confirmation, in which symbolic resonance is mistaken for historical continuity, in which any sorts of other claims are dismissed as deranged rather than answered or confronted, and finally in which one's own theology quietly becomes, the secret template through which every earlier revelation must now be read. That is, in fact, the trademark of a self-made guru. At that point, one is not preserving a tradition or rediscovering it. One is only staging oneself to the wreckage of that tradition. And this matters because, occulture has always had a sort of weakness for intensity. So someone speaks with enough conviction, invokes enough lineage, surround themselves with enough esoteric gravity, and maybe many people will mistake that for depth. Sometimes it is depth. Quite often, it is only the confidence wearing some sort of sacred parallel. It's the skill of the con artist. I really think that occulture already has enough of grandstanding and misdirection. I don't think it does need any more of it being pumped into the room on purpose. We don't need new prophets. We don't need new gurus. We need honest and earnest seekers, those who walk the path and maybe can show the path to others, but without any sort of strange prophetic cloth put on them. Unless, of course, your goal is, in truth, but gathering yet another flock of sheep that will call you a guru. And yes, that remark was in fact sarcastic. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will.